So it's been a while since I've made a D&D video, and there's a lot to talk about now that the new 2024 rule set is finally out, so I'll probably make some more videos in the not too distant future. But I have to admit that there has been something a lot more fundamental about D&D's core design that has been kind of nagging at the back of my mind for a little bit. So I thought I might make a quick video to have an excuse to talk about it. And well, you've read the title of this video, so let's get into it. Why is Constitution a stat in D&D? And I do mean that seriously. When looking at D&D critically and through the lens of game design, Constitution almost feels like a paradox of a stat. On one hand, it barely seems to actively do anything for virtually any character build outside of a few niche use cases, but also at the same time, it's still too important of a stat for most any character to ignore, with pretty much every character almost always avoiding putting it in the negatives. So, I wanted to just do a quick video to ask, why is this the case? How big of a problem is this? And what can we do about it? So let's start with examining more about why I think Constitution is so weird. Every other stat in D&D has some inherent use case that you can actively use that stat for in fairly common scenarios. Strength and dexterity are of course primarily used for martial combat skills and other such active physical activities such as athletics and acrobatics. And all of the mental stats have a bevy of skills associated with them, from arcana to medicine to persuasion and many more. Now, sure, you can technically use Constitution for a few things. Like, if you need to hold your breath, your Constitution determines how long you can do that. And you can make con checks to try and exert yourself if you want to, say, travel somewhere faster or for longer in a day. But these are relatively niche use cases, and arguably, there are usually a lot better options than actually relying on your Constitution stat. Like, if you need to travel somewhere faster, then surely in most cases you would just get a horse or a carriage, or if you're high enough level, you would just have a wizard cast fly or teleport. And if you need to be underwater for an extended period of time, then at that point you're probably going to be commissioning a water breathing spell at the very least. In general, it's pretty easy to override a lot of the active use cases for Constitution with magical or even just normal mundane means. Then, on top of that, no class in the game actually uses Constitution as their primary stat. Martial characters like fighters and rogues, of course, use strength and dexterity, and naturally, all of the spellcasters use the various mental stats for whatever flavor of magic that they cast. There was talk about the idea of converting the sorcerer to a Constitution based spellcaster at one point, which I think personally makes sense from a flavor standpoint, but it obviously didn't turn out that way in the latest rule set. The closest we get is the barbarian, which at least gets an ability that uses Constitution in their unarmored defense feature, but I mean, let's face it, it's kind of a bad ability. I mean, to use it effectively, you basically need to invest not only in Constitution, but also Dexterity, but on a class that already cares even more about maxing out Strength. So you could do all of that and spread yourself really thin, or you could just wear medium armor and get your dex to 14 and call it a day, especially when talking about basically any build under like level 12 or something. Other than that, there are a few old legacy subclasses from the 2014 rules that use Constitution, like the Wild Magic Barbarian or the Rune Knight Fighter, which use Con to determine their saving throw DCs, but that's pretty much about it. At best, Constitution is a secondary ability score, if that, and otherwise it's very situational. And yet, despite that, it's still too important to ignore for the more passive and defensive benefits it grants. Constitution saving throws aren't the most common saving throw, that's are easily dexterity, but they're still pretty common and can be pretty debilitating to fail, as it's typically associated with things like poison and disease. But of course, the big thing that Constitution is used for is determining your health pool. But even that's not really exclusive to Constitution yourself, because the class that you play arguably has a much bigger effect on your health pool, considering that it determines the size of your hit die. After all, even the smallest hit die that classes like the wizard get, a d6, still means that you're getting 3.5 hit points on average if you're rolling randomly. And a lot of tables don't roll randomly anymore, in which case the minimum health gained per level is 4, or the equivalent of having an 18 in Constitution. So for Constitution to be responsible for anything more than 50% of your health, you basically need to max it out entirely. Obviously, any amount of extra HP is nice, and that's why people typically don't dump Constitution, but it really feels like from a design perspective, we could practically get rid of the health bonus altogether, make your health determined entirely by your class, and just call it a day. But ultimately, even if you agree with everything that I just said, why is this necessarily even a problem? So D&D has a pretty niche stat with only a handful of use cases that basically everybody only puts points in to get more health. Is this really that big of a problem? Well, ultimately, it all ties back into, and some of you probably saw this coming, so let's say it together, the Martial and Caster balance disparity. That's right, I fooled you all. The guy who has made multiple videos tackling the Martial-Caster divide was secretly making yet another video on the subject the whole time. But, like, for real, to be more specific, the nature of how Constitution is designed kinda screws over frontline tanks more than anything. For comparison, when you look at spellcasters, well, they get pretty much everything that they could want out of just one stat. As long as they max out whatever mental stat they use for their spells, they can blow up enemies, they can cast defensive spells, they can do pretty much everything to a high level of effectiveness. Now, sure, having more good stats is always better. Nobody would turn down having more Constitution if they can get it. But the nature of a spellcaster as a backliner inherently means that they need Constitution less. So it's more just icing on the cake for them, because they can rely on more defensive spells like Shield or Wall of Force or whatever to protect themselves. Their ability to attack at a range means that they can do things like move to take cover and run away when enemies try to close in on them. And just in general, it's the role of the rest of the party to stand in front of them so that they don't get hurt. But then when you shift perspective to those characters who actually have to stand on the front line, suddenly now the nature of Constitution becomes a problem. These are your characters that need as much health as possible just to stay alive. Sure, you can boost your AC to try and avoid getting hit, but you can never dodge every attack, and various AoE effects like your classic Fireball do damage even if you pass your saving throw, so your health will always go down in a combat. But there's only so many points to go around, so investing in Constitution might mean you're not actually investing in your primary stat, so you end up being weaker at the things your class actually wants to do just so that you can be better at staying alive because you're in a more dangerous situation. And as I've hopefully demonstrated in my previous videos, the martial classes really don't need any help being weaker than the spellcasters. Now, not to mention that Constitution's uselessness when it comes to active skills just means that you also get less out of investing in it. If a strength-based fighter invests in dexterity, then they get better skills like acrobatics and stealth. If they invest it in wisdom, they get better perception and insight. But if they invest it in Constitution, yeah, they get more health, but they don't actually get anything useful that they can use in role-playing situations. Also, I think it's worth pointing out that even if you do want to invest in Constitution regardless of all these problems, there's just a lot fewer ways to actually do it. One of the changes I really like about the new 2024 rule set is that almost every feat is now a half feat that gives you both a stat buff and some new abilities. This is great because just watching a number go up is boring, and just getting new abilities while leaving your stats behind is often not necessarily a favorable trade. So this way you get to expand your abilities in much more fun ways while still letting your stats increase over time. But most feats only let you level up certain specific stats, so there's a bit of disparity as to how many feats let you level each different stat. If we go through the list and count them up, interestingly enough, strength and dexterity are actually the stats that have the most feats associated with them having a whopping 20 options each to choose from. Though this is somewhat offset by the fact that a lot of these feats are very specific to certain playstyles. You're not going to pick the Piercer feat unless you want to wield a weapon that does piercing damage. You're not going to pick the Polearm Master feat unless you wield polearms. You get the idea. But it's still nice that they have so many options to hopefully better cater to a wider variety of playstyles. Then you have the mental stats, with each of them having about a dozen options to pick from if you want to upgrade that stat. Significantly less than strength and dexterity, but they have the opposite style of design that causes the mental stats to be a lot more flexible. For example, there's a lot of mental feats like Fey Touched and Ritual Caster, which not only let you upgrade any of the mental stats, but they also let you learn a wide variety of spells. So even if two players pick that same feat, they might learn a wildly different set of abilities from that feat. So it's kind of like having dozens of feat all compressed into a single option. So ultimately, there's really more options with the mental feats despite the smaller overall number. So this kind of works out fine. But then we get to Constitution, which, if you go through the whole list in just the 2024 Player's Handbook, I'm not counting splat books to be fair, this only leaves us with 6 actual feats that specifically let you upgrade it in the new rule set. And needless to say, they don't have nearly as much variety as the spellcasting feats, so it kinda gets saddled with the worst of both worlds. There are simultaneously fewer options to pick from when you want to upgrade Constitution, and the options that you have are a lot more specific and a lot less flexible, so if they don't already cater to your playstyle, then those feats just aren't really an option for you. For example, one of the few options you have to upgrade your con is to take heavy armor training, which, even if you don't have the ability to use heavy armor, is hardly an interesting ability compared to things like learning new spells that you can cast. But obviously, if you're playing a class like a fighter or a paladin, then you already have heavy armor training. So we've already gotten one feat off of the list, just like that. Same with things like the Crusher feat, which only works if you can reliably deal bludgeoning damage. So if you don't use blunt weapons, then this feat is just not really an option for you. And similarly, Heavy Armor Master obviously requires heavy armor training in order for you to take it. So if you're playing something like a barbarian or a monk who definitely still want lots of constitution but are almost never seeing wearing heavy armor, then this feat is also useless to you. So like, for example, if you're just playing like a normal barbarian wielding a great axe, then you've already cut the number of options to upgrade your constitution in half. So finally, the question then becomes, what can we do about this? Well, the way that I see it, there's two obvious directions that you could go. The first is to try and actually make Constitution more useful as an active stat. Add more classes, subclasses, abilities, skills, and feats to the game that actually scale off of or let you upgrade Constitution so that you can actually make a Constitution-based character and get good value out of it. And characters that use Constitution as a secondary stat will also get more value out of it through these changes. But this does obviously have some downsides. Obviously, this would take a lot of work, not to mention that it might be difficult to actually come up with things like skills that actually scale off of Constitution. After all, there's a reason why there aren't currently any in the game. Plus, while adding more value to the stat would be nice, it would still mean that your frontline tanks still need to invest into multiple different stats in order to be effective, while most other kinds of characters get to focus on only one stat. So there is, of course, then the opposite direction that we could go, which is to just get rid of Constitution entirely. Or, I guess to be more specific, combine Constitution with Strength to create a new stat, which, for the sake of simplicity, I'll just call Might for now. Now, why would we do this? Would this just make Might way too good of a stat? Well, I think it could work because Strength as a stat, in D&D at least, is kind of paradoxical, similar to Constitution, but in the opposite way. Strength does a lot of things, at least on paper. It governs all melee attacks as well as thrown weapons. It is far from the most common saving throw out there, but there are at least a lot of things that do call for strength saves. And while there is only one skill associated with it, athletics is a pretty broad catch-all skill for basically applying brute force to most situations. And yet, despite all this, strength is also one of the most commonly dumped stats by most characters, making it pretty much the opposite of constitution in that regard. And I think that there are a few reasons for this. Despite the number of things that strength is useful for, it tends to get overshadowed pretty easily. Like, yeah, you could brace a door with your strength to try and keep the enemies out, or you could just cast like arcane lock and just keep running. But even if we ignore magic, there's a further divide within the martial characters due to the disparity of how good dexterity is compared to strength. Dexterity is strength's natural counterpart, of course, but just look at how much it does by comparison. Dexterity handles the ranged weapons while strength handles melee, which sounds fair on the surface, except that the ranged weapons are, to be frank, better than melee weapons. Yes, melee weapons do technically do a little more damage on average, but that is more than made up for by the opportunity cost of having to run into melee and put yourself in a lot more danger. I mean, hell, if you have to spend a turn just running up in order to get within range to stab someone, that means you've now lost out on an entire turn's worth of damage, whereas the ranged archer in the back is able to keep attacking every turn. So arguably that already alone makes up for the damage difference. And of course, having to run up to the front lines in the first place is why I said earlier that strength based characters tend to also need a lot of constitution, while dexterity and spell based characters can rely on their range to stay out of danger, take cover, and just generally use their movement a lot more tactically. Plus, if you really want to get involved in melee, a dex based character could just use finesse weapons, or they can take a feat that lets them ignore the penalty from using a ranged weapon in melee, while strength has no such equivalent. Yes, thrown strength weapons have like paltry ranges by comparison, and it's not like you can take a feat that lets you suddenly attack someone with a greatsword from 100 feet away. But of course, defensively, dexterity also gives you AC for free. Now, strength technically can give you AC as well, but you have to specifically buy heavy armor to actually make use of it, and especially early on, that can be extraordinarily expensive, while dexterity just gives you an AC bonus for free without needing any kind of proficiency or money expenditure, or at the very least a much cheaper one. And of course, dexterity also gives you a bunch of other stuff like bonuses to initiative, and you can use it for various skills like acrobatics, sleight of hand, and stealth. And of course, dexterity saving throws, as I mentioned earlier, are easily the most common type of saving throw in the game by far. Now, after listening to all this, you might be thinking, does this mean that dexterity is actually quite a bit overpowered? And the answer to that question is yes, pretty objectively so. But in a sense, I think that this can be fine. I'm not trying to argue that every stat has to be equally as powerful or useful, because dexterity, in the grand scheme of things, can actually work by being powerful because it can help balance out the fact that martial characters tend to be weaker than spellcasters who rely on mental stats. So giving them stats that do a lot more for them can help, give them a little bit of a boost to make up for that difference. The only issue is that strength is falling way behind dexterity's par. And so that brings us back to the idea of combining strength and constitution. Pretty much every strength-based character would want constitution anyways, so why don't we just give it to them? By doing this and creating this new might stat, as I've called it, now I feel like might is a lot more on par with dexterity. It still costs a lot of money to buy heavy armor to get good AC, but now you at least get free health for having a high might score, which provides a defensive benefit that is not only passive like dexterity, but it also feels distinct from dexterity and how it grants you only AC specifically. And by combining the constitution and strength saving throws into a single stat, then they might actually be used almost as commonly equivalently as dexterity saving throws are. And what few abilities there are in the game that do use Constitution, like the Barbarian's Unarmored Defense and the Dragonborn's Breath Weapon and whatnot, those can scale off of Might now, which would mean that they actually would synergize with builds that use Might. And of course, all of the feats that can be used to upgrade Strength can now upgrade Might, so now you have a ton of options to play with, and if you just want to generally become a stronger, tougher powerhouse. But to be fair, it isn't all rainbows and sunshine. If I really wanted to implement this properly into the game, we would have to do things like rebalance the way that your starting stats are distributed in order to account for the fact that we're basically removing an entire stat. And I guess this would mean changing a lot of monster and NPC stat blocks, though I guess if you really wanted to kind of implement this more quickly, you could have this change only really apply to the players, and then you can keep the NPCs and monsters as is pretty easily. But one big thing I think you do need to watch out for is that we'd probably have to remove all of the magic items that can be used to buff strength and constitution, or at least rework them to not actually modify the core stat of might in the same way anymore. After all, the reason why those items exist is arguably because of how weak strength and constitution are as stats. I mean, think about it. There are items like the Gauntlets of Ogre Strength to buff your strength, obviously, and the Amulet of Health to buff your constitution, but there's no equivalent for dexterity. Yes, if you want to be pedantic, there are the tomes that can boost any stat by +2 once a century, but those are like very rare artifacts that are clearly not like in the same caliber. My point is that there isn't an item that you can slap on to raise your dexterity to 19 from like 8 like you can with other stats. And I think that's because the designers recognize that dexterity is far too powerful and useful of a stat to warrant such an item. And I think that this new might stat also warrants not having such items so readily available. So, like, maybe we can change the constitution items to ones that just give you more health and like resistance to certain kinds of damage, and old strength items could probably be modified to just give you like a damage bonus to melee and thrown weapons, and maybe give you a similar bonus to athletic checks, so that it doesn't actually modify your stats anymore while still making you quote unquote stronger, or something like that. If I did go through with making this into a full-blown homebrew mod for 5e, I definitely would have to put some proper work into it. But for now, feel free to let me know what you think of this idea in the comments down below. I might honestly try running a homebrew 5e game or a one-shot or something with these changes for some of my friends, just to see how it plays and feels. I mean, maybe I'm totally wrong and this doesn't work at all, and I'm sure that I'll get plenty of comments pointing out some of the other flaws that I might need to address if I wanted to actually implement this properly as a 5e homebrew. But even if you don't want to play 5e, I think that you could still take away from this as like a sort of design element to keep a lookout for when looking at other systems. After all, you don't want to roll up a character in a new game that you're playing for the first time only to realize that the main stats that you're focused on are about as useful as Constitution is in D&D. Not to mention that this is something to keep in mind if you ever want to create your own game someday. The way that stats work and their functionality within a game can really define just how a system plays and feels at its most fundamental levels. And I feel like an obvious takeaway is that every stat in a game should at least feel impactful and be as fun as possible to play with, instead of just acting as a sort of tax on certain kinds of characters. After all, I think it's best to avoid repeating the mistakes of RPGs that do silly things like add stats such as luck or sensibility or whatever, just because they felt like it would round out their stat spread, and then they barely actually utilize those stats, and it becomes no shocker that nobody actually makes builds around them. After all, I have been wanting to take a crack at designing my own tabletop RPG at some point, so this is definitely another design tip that I'll be remembering for when I eventually get around to doing that. But for now, thank you all for watching. Remember to like and subscribe if you like what you saw, and I hope to see you all in the next one.